Hello everyone, this is Deltrox from Masque, and today I'm going to be talking about common buffs and debuffs. I've had a few questions about this lately, about what buffs are redundant, which ones are needed, things like that. And so I'm just going to kind of get right into the thick of things and start explaining which buffs are common, how common they are, and what they do. And so the first and probably most important debuff in the game is Major Fracture and Breach. This is a debuff, that will be applied by your tank most of the time. From their taunting ability, it gives an additional 5,280 penetration, which is equivalent to 10.56% additional damage. And so this Major Fracture also comes from the Nightblade's Surprise Attack ability and the Stam DK's Poison Breath. And so that's why if you're using those abilities, your parse tends to look a little bit higher for stamina tunes. And so that's one of the reasons why Stam Blades have such high parses. And Major Breach comes from Elemental Drain as well, which every Magicka class should have during a parse, so that is at least fairly evened out. And so the next one I'm going to talk about is Major Courage, which is the most important buff your healer can give you. It gives you 258 additional weapon and spell damage, and it comes from the sets Spell Power Cure and Vestments of Olorine. This is equivalent to 1.6 non-infused jewelry enchants, and your jewelry enchants are super important, and so it basically gives you another 1.5 jewelry enchants, which is huge. And so next up is Minor Maim, which is 15% less damage dealt by the target. And so this is applied by your tanks most of the time, with either Heroic Slash, which will put it on the boss, Choking Talons, which is an AoE version of it, but doesn't apply to bosses. And then with Ice Blockade, any ice damage has a chance of applying Chilled, which applies Minor Maim. And so Minor Maim is important because it not only affects the boss's attacks, but the boss's mechanics too. And so a good example of this is in Cradle of Shadows, where Veladreth has her little rolly explodey bombs everywhere. They will do less damage if she is affected by Minor Maim. So next up is Minor Vulnerability, which is probably the most confusing debuff in the game, because it has wildly varying uptimes. So Major Fracture, Major Courage, Minor Maim, all of those should be at pretty close to 100% uptime. Minor Vulnerability is really hard to tell what the uptime is going to be like. It could be either really, really high if you have like a healer using Infallible Ether, or it could be really, really low if you just have a whole bunch of people using Flame Staves. But what it does is it is 8% additional damage done to a target. This comes from Concussed, which is the special effect added by lightning damage. And so here is a chart. All this information is by Leofa. He is an amazing tank. He is a Warden tank. He was Warden tanking since the class came out, I think. Very talented tank. Look him up on YouTube. I know he has some videos. But anyways, as you can see, weapon enchants have a 20% chance to apply concussion. A standard ability, so a standard single target ability, has a 10% chance. An area of effect ability has a 5% chance. A damage over time ability, so a single target dot, has a 3% chance. And an area of effect damage over time ability, so your ground AoEs, will have a 1% chance. And so as you can see, if you have like just Magicka Sorks using double Inferno Staves without any shock enchants or anything like that, you're not going to get the best Minor Vulnerability uptime. But if you have like a Magicka Sorcerer who is doing like a heavy attack build, has a shock enchant, and uses Force Pulse, like you're going to get way higher uptimes. And then, like I said, Infallible Aether is a healer set, which is when heavy attacking, apply minor vulnerability to the target for, I believe it's 8 seconds. It's either 8 or 10. And so if you have a healer using Infallible Aether, minor vulnerability should be up at 100%. There is also a tank set, Live Wire, which applies concussion when the tank is hit. Sorry. And so Live Wire is kind of like the tank version of Infallible Aether. Now give me 1 second, I'm going to take a drink of water here. Alright, next up... Oh, geez, my voice is cracking all over the place today. So next up is Minor Berserk, which is 8% additional damage. This tends to come from the healer's ability Combat Prayer, which is a skill in the Restoration Staff line. But if you are a Nightblade, you will also have this on yourself only. And if you are a Warden, you will have it from the ability Falcon Swiftness, which is the wings that Wardens get that gives them major expedition. You will get it from that ability just for being slotted. And so this is yet another reason why Nightblades tend to have higher parses than any other class. Next up is Minor Slayer, which is 5% additional damage to trial and dungeon mobs, which is pretty much everything. And so this comes from the majority of trial armor sets. There are a few notable exceptions. I believe Vicious Ophidian does not have it, which is the one that I think of right away. But Reliquin and Sororia both have it. And so if a DPS is using that set, specifically Reliquin, they will also do quite a bit more damage. But Magicka DPS have a lot less attractive version of Minor Slayer, which comes from Mantle of Sororia, which is a very difficult to use set. So next up is Major Slayer, which is 25% additional damage, which is huge. And this comes from War Machine and Master Architect. And so these sets tend to only be used in a trial environment, because these sets are, when you use an ultimate ability, give yourself and I believe it's 2 other targets Major Slayer for however many seconds. I believe it's either 5 or 10. And so in a dungeon environment, if you're running a healer, it's guaranteed to go on the healer or the tank, which isn't great. Possibly even both of them, which really isn't great. If you're running 3 DPS, it's a lot better, because then you have a chance of it actually going onto all 3 DPS, which is good. But in general, it'll mainly be used in a trial environment. And so if you see any like crazy parses in a trial environment, like 70k plus, it's usually because they have really high Major Slayer uptimes. So next up is Major Force. This is 15% additional critical damage, and this comes from Aggressive Warhorn. And so when you hear the Warhorn go off, if you are a tank without Yorvold's Guidance, it'll last for 9.5 seconds. And then if you happen to be a healer who is wearing Yorvold's Guidance, it'll last for 14.5 seconds. Or maybe 13.5. But either way, it lasts a substantial amount longer. And so when this is happening, all your critical damage is increased by 15%. And so that's why tanks and healers in trial environments are on a Warhorn rotation. And so the other buff from Warhorn, which is 10% additional magicka and stamina, lasts for 30 seconds without Yorvold's, and then like 45 with, but doesn't really matter. That buff should be at 100% no matter what. And the actual Warhorn rotation is for keeping up Major Force as much as possible, which, like, a perfect Warhorn rotation will keep Major Force up at about 70% of the time. But like I said, that is a perfect rotation with people building for it and everything. And so next up is going to be Engulfing Flames. This is a Dragon Knight ability that is used by tanks and mag DKs. This does 10% additional fire damage. And so this is another reason why fire staves are so meta right now. is because basically fire stabs get this bonus and lightning stabs get the minor vulnerability bonus, but minor vulnerability can be applied from other sources, while 10% additional fire damage can only be used if you're doing fire damage, obviously. And so next up is Minor Fracture and Breach, which is an additional 1320 penetration. And so this is an additional 2.64% additional damage. This comes from Stamplar's Power of the Light ability, most, easiest. It comes from a few other sources as well, like Templar healers can technically use Power of the Light. It comes from sets like Hands of Mafala, the ability Focused Aim. There are poisons that apply it, but really the only reliable source of it is from Stamplars. And so unless you have a Stamplar in your group, you probably can count on this effect not being active. Next up is Roar of Alkosh. This is a unique effect, does not stack, and it gives 3010 penetration. And so this equals 6.02% additional damage. And so that is why Alkosh is the strongest tank set, because if you compare the 3000 additional pen, the 6% additional damage, to our next buff, which is Crusher. And so Crusher is a weapon enchant for the tank, and normally a tank will just have Infused, which gives 2800 pen, or 4.216% additional damage. Or, if you are wearing the set Torugs, which is also considered a very powerful tank set, it will give you 2740 pen, or 5.48% damage. And so, Roar of Alkosh gives 6% additional damage, while Torugs gives 1.2% additional damage. And Torugs is a very strong set, so that just goes to show exactly how powerful Alkosh is. And so the other enchant that tanks use is Weakening. If your tank is not using an Ice Staff or Lightning Staff backbar, this will likely be up at a very low percent, so you can't really rely on it. But if they are using Elemental Blockade, then it will be up much more frequently. And so this is normally infused, gives 452 less weapon and spell damage to the target, while Torugs gives 587 less weapon spell damage on target. This buff is a little bit confusing because nobody really knows exactly how much that reduces. According to Alcast, this is about 30% damage reduction on the boss, which I tend to believe him because he is a very, very, very skilled player and very knowledgeable about the game. And so take that for what you will. It's anywhere from 20 to 40% damage reduction for the boss. Similarly, there is the Mending set, which is a healer set. This gives 430 less weapon and spell damage on the target, which is very similar to a infused weakening enchant. And then you have Sanctuary, which is another healer set, which just gives 8% additional healing to the entire group. It's one of those orb effects. It is the green orbs. It's a reasonably powerful set. 8% healing is nothing to scoff at, but usually groups aren't having issues with not enough healing. And so that's why Sanctuary has kind of fallen out of favor. Similarly, there is Worm's Raiment, which is the blue orbs, which gives 4% less magicka cost on abilities. This is also a healer set that has recently fallen out of favor, just because other sets are better right now, to be honest. 4% less magicka cost is powerful. It's about 1.5 jewelry enchants, which, as we saw from Major Courage, is very, very powerful. Just in general, magicka cost isn't needed right now. DPS would rather have additional damage, which comes from sets like Olarim and Yorvold's Guidance. And so next up are the potion buffs, which is Major Brutality and Sorcery, which is 20% additional weapon and spell damage, Major Savagery and Prophecy, which is 20% additional weapon and spell crit, and Major Intellect and Endurance, which is 20% additional magicka and stamina recovery. So all 3 of these come from potions. The magicka versions come from the spell power potions, which is made with lady smock, cornflower, and water hyacinth. And the stamina version comes from weapon power pots, which is dragon thorn, blessed thistle, and wormwood. And so these buffs are able to be kept up at 100% uptime as long as you have the medicinal use passive in the alchemy tree. So if you're a DPS and you don't have that, or if you're a healer and you don't have that, make sure to get that. Takes about 15 minutes to level up your alchemy, put the 3 points in it, and then you can take all your other points out of alchemy and don't have to worry about it again. But it's very, very important to get because these buffs are very, very powerful. And so the last buff that I'm going to talk about as a common buff is Minor Magicka Steal. This comes from Elemental Drain, which is usually provided by healers. Occasionally it will be provided by tanks or a DPS. This is restoring 200 magicka every second while damaging a target. And so that is equivalent to 400 magicka recovery, which is a ton. It is something that DPS or magicka DPS can and should rely on. It should always be there, even in parses. The magicka DPS should either be applying it themselves or it should be applied by an outside source. And so the last 5 buffs I'm going to talk about are the unique class buffs. Every class has a unique buff that only comes from them. It comes from no other source in the game, with the exception of Minor Toughness, which comes from the Warrior Poet set as well. And so the first one to talk about is Minor Brutality, which is 10% additional weapon damage. This is equivalent to 300 to 400 weapon damage usually. Stamina classes tend to have more weapon damage than magicka classes have spell damage, and so this is typically a stronger buff than Minor Sorcery. Minor Brutality comes from DK tanks specifically, with Igneous Shields applies it for 20 seconds. DK DPS can use it, but in general Earthen Heart, which is where this ability comes from, is a tank skill set. And so next up you have Minor Prophecy, which is 10% additional spell crit. This comes from Templars. It'll come from a healer, DPS, or tank Templar. I do not know exactly off the top of my head what skill line it comes from, but pretty much everybody will cast a skill that comes from this skill line if you're a Templar. Next up is Minor Toughness, which I briefly mentioned before. This gives 10% additional health. This comes from Warden's Green Lotus abilities, or Green Balance abilities, which is their healing tree. And so this is equivalent to 1.8k HP, usually, give or take, for DPS, and about 4 to 5k HP for tanks. And so this is actually a super important buff, and in my opinion, the strongest class buff, because it used to come from Warhorn, which was one of the reasons why Warhorn was so ridiculously strong. Obviously, there are other reasons, because Warhorn is still ridiculously strong. But Minor Toughness in general is just a very, very powerful buff. And now that it comes from Wardens alone, Wardens are a bit more desirable, especially in the healing role. As I mentioned before, this buff also comes from Warrior Poet, but it's... Warrior Poet's bad, so don't rely on that. Okay, next up is Minor Sorcery, which I briefly mentioned before. This comes from Sorcerers. I believe it only comes from Magicka Sorcerers. I believe it comes from the Dark Magic skill line, but I'm not sure. Stamina Sorcerers, especially some off-meta builds, will likely have this as well. This gives 10% additional spell damage, which is usually about 200 spell damage. Like I mentioned before, this isn't quite as powerful as Minor Brutality, just because of the way multiplicative bonuses work, and Minor Sorcery is applying to a smaller number at the beginning. Spell damage is harder to come by than weapon damage. And so last up is Minor Savagery. This comes from Nightblades. I'm pretty sure it comes from one of their super easy to use skill lines because it's up all the frickin' time. If you have a Nightblade in your group, which you probably do, they're by far the most popular class from what I've seen, you'll have 10% additional weapon crit. This happens all the time. It's always up. It's crazy. And so yeah, that's just additional weapon crit, which is great for stand blades. Mag blades obviously don't get anything from it. And so that was all the buffs that I have to talk about today. I'm sure I missed some, but these are the important ones. There are a few niche buffs that I didn't mention, stuff like Powerful Assault, that you might occasionally see in a trial environment, but in general, and especially in dungeon groups, you probably shouldn't rely on seeing it. Anyways, thank you for listening. This has been Deltrox from Violet Masque. I hope this video was helpful. Sorry for my voice, it was kind of all over the place today. I've been on vacation for about 2 weeks, and so I haven't been doing nearly as much talking as I normally do, so my voice is a little bit weaker. I also got a new microphone for Christmas, and so I'm hoping that you all noticed the improvement in audio quality. It's a very nice microphone. I'm still getting used to how to use it, and so I might not have it set up completely correctly right now, and I'm sure my equalizer settings and things like that are going to be off. But in general, I hope the quality of this video was better than the previous videos. And as always, if you have any questions, leave a comment, message me in-game, message me on Discord if you have that, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.